Welcome, dear friends, to tonight's tale, The Corpse in the Christmas Pudding, a Miss Marple Mystery. Picture, if you will, the quiet village of Marleycombe on a snowy December evening. White drifts rest gently upon tiled roofs, church bells chime faintly through the frosted air, and golden light glows from windows where fires crackle and tea steams. All seems peaceful, wrapped in the charm of an English Christmas. Yet appearances, as we know, can deceive. Tell me, have you ever found a surprise in a Christmas pudding? Imagine if, instead of a silver coin, you uncovered something far more sinister. Christmas Eve in Marleycombe always carried a special kind of cheer. At the rectory, the great hall was alive with laughter and the rustle of holly garlands. Villagers gathered shoulder to shoulder, cheeks flushed from the cold, their voices raised in familiar carols. The vicar, beaming with pride, gave thanks before supper, and the tables gleamed with roasted meats, potatoes crisped to perfection, and steaming tureens of broth. Yet it was the pudding, carried in last, that everyone awaited with childlike delight. With a hush of anticipation, Mrs. Hargreaves swept forward, her creation blazing with blue brandy flames. Applause broke out, glasses clinked, and the children craned their necks to watch. Plates were filled, spoons dipped, laughter swelled, until it stuttered and fell away. From the thick richness of fruit and spice, a guest drew forth not a coin, nor a lucky charm, but something pale, hard, and unmistakably wrong. A bone, small, human, and dreadful in its suggestion. Silence settled like frost over the room. Faces blanched, eyes darted. At the far end of the table, Miss Jane Marple lowered her spoon, her gaze steady and clear. While others gaped in disbelief, she merely observed. For she knew, such things never happen by chance. Chapter 1. Whispers by Lamplight. By the following morning, Marleycombe was no longer the picture of Christmas cheer. Snow still lay thick upon the lanes, smoke still curled from cottage chimneys, but the air was different, charged with whispers and uneasy glances. At the butcher's shop, Mr. Trask declared loudly, while trimming a side of ham, that the whole business at the rectory supper had been nothing but a macabre joke. Young men's mischief, he insisted, wagging his knife for emphasis. Yet his laugh rang hollow, and his customers did not linger over their purchases. At the rectory itself, the vicar reassured parishioners with trembling hands folded over his cassock. "A dreadful mistake," he murmured. "Surely some trick of the kitchen." But his eyes betrayed a shadow of fear, as though he longed to believe his own words. Over at Mrs. Penfold's tea-room, the gossip swirled thicker than the steam above the teapots. Ladies bent their heads together, voices lowered to scandalous whispers. Some spoke of curses, old family feuds woven into puddings. Others muttered of sins that refused to stay buried, rising up in ghastly symbols. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her corner with her customary pot of Earl Grey, neither added to nor discouraged the chatter. She listened, her knitting needles clicking softly. To her it was telling, not the words themselves, but the eagerness with which some tongues wagged, and the determined silence of others. For in a village such as Marleycombe, silence often concealed more than speech. And Miss Marple, with her keen blue eyes, never overlooked such things. Constable Hughes made his rounds that morning with an air of forced cheer, stamping snow from his boots at every threshold. At the grocer's, at the baker's, even at the post office, He repeated the same refrain, as though he had rehearsed it before his looking-glass. "Now then, nothing to fret over, nothing sinister at all. Just an unfortunate bit of nonsense, that's what it is." His words tumbled out with brisk authority, but his ruddy face betrayed unease, and his eyes flickered away from those who pressed him with questions. Villagers longed for reassurance, and many clung to his statement as though it were gospel. But others, hearing the waver in his voice, began to wonder all the more. For what sort of nonsense could deposit a human bone into a Christmas pudding? Miss Marple, seated near the window of the tea-room with her knitting in her lap, listened as Hughes addressed the gathered crowd. She noted every inflection, every sidestep in his explanation. He spoke of the pudding, of Mrs. Hargreaves' fine reputation, of the impossibility of foul play in a place as decent as Marleycombe. Yet never once did he so much as hint at the essential question, how the bone came to be there. Her needles clicked gently, rhythmically, as she observed the constable's discomfort. It was not deliberate concealment, she thought, but the instinct of a man who feared more than he understood. And when men feared to ask the simplest question, it was often because they dreaded the answer. Miss Marple smiled faintly, unseen. She knew the truth had not yet been spoken aloud. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in her snug little parlour, the fire casting a steady glow upon the chintz curtains and polished brass. Outside, snow drifted against the panes, softening the world into silence. Within, the only sounds were the occasional crackle of the logs and the steady rhythm of her knitting needles. Her thoughts, however, were far from tranquil. She had seen many strange things in her long life, and more than once had observed how wickedness preferred to wear a mask of ordinariness. A poisoned glass of cordial, a deadly draught folded into a letter, or a weapon hidden within the most everyday of objects, such cases came readily to mind. Evil seldom arrived in dramatic costume. Instead, it nestled itself in the homely and familiar, where suspicion was least likely to tread. She paused in her knitting, gazing into the flames. "People seldom do the shocking thing outright," she murmured softly. "They wrap it in something homely, like pastry or pudding." The bone discovered in last night's dessert could not be dismissed as chance. It had the air of a message, a deliberate intrusion into the comfort of Christmas cheer. And messages, Miss Marple knew, were rarely without purpose. Though the village might chatter and the constable reassure, she sensed they had only glimpsed the shadow of something larger, something that would not remain hidden for long. She folded her knitting neatly upon her lap, her eyes thoughtful. This was but the beginning. Chapter 2. The Shadows of Christmas Eve. The following morning found Mrs. Hargreaves in a flurry, her ample frame squeezed behind the counter of her kitchen, hands dusted with flour as though she could busy herself into forgetting. She insisted to anyone who would listen that the pudding had been prepared with utmost care, following her grandmother's recipe exactly as it had been for generations. Suet, raisins, candied peel, a drop of stout, and the silver coin for luck, nothing more, nothing less, she declared, her cheeks blotched with indignation. Miss Marple, seated primly at the kitchen table with her knitting bag at her side, offered no challenge. Instead, she inquired in her gentle conversational way, had all the ingredients been purchased fresh, and from whom? Had anyone besides Mrs. Hargreaves handled the mixture before it was boiled and set away? Had the pudding, perhaps, been left unattended for even a few moments? Mrs. Hargreaves, still flustered, admitted that she had stepped out once to see to the washing, leaving the bowl upon the table. "But only for a tick, Miss Marple. Why, the cat was the only creature in that kitchen at the time." Miss Marple smiled kindly, but her eyes remained thoughtful. Kitchens were like crossroads in a village, always a place where feet wandered in and out, where errands were run, and hands might meddle if given the chance. And if a pudding had carried such a grim token into the heart of the rectory feast, it had been no accident of recipe. Somewhere between the flour and the brandy, purpose had crept in. As the talk of the pudding spread, another detail surfaced, half forgotten in the tumult of the evening. At the far end of the rectory table there had been a vacant chair before the evening drew to its close. Mr. Percival Grant, retired solicitor and a man known for his prickly correctness, had risen rather abruptly, muttering something about indigestion and the need for fresh air. His departure had been noted only with polite nods at the time, for no one wished to detain a gentleman in discomfort. By morning, however, his absence became something more than a trivial matter. His shutters remained drawn, his garden gate fastened, and no answer came to repeated knocks upon his door. The milk left on the step had frozen solid in its bottle, undisturbed. Whispers multiplied swiftly. Some said he had gone to London, though none could recall him mentioning it. Others hinted that he had stormed out in anger, though what could have provoked him was anyone's guess. Constable Hughes rattled the latch, frowned, and declared that the house was secure, though the word rang oddly when coupled with the thought of a missing man. Miss Marple, hearing of this empty chair and the locked little house, felt a familiar tightening in her chest. Retired solicitors, she knew, seldom left matters untidy. A closed house, an unanswered door, and a vanished guest at a Christmas supper, these were not coincidences. Quietly, she tucked the detail away among her growing collection of observations. The pudding might have shocked the village, but the absence of Mr. Grant whispered of something darker still. That afternoon, with her black coat buttoned snugly against the cold, Miss Marple took her customary walk through the churchyard. The air was still and bright, the snow crisp underfoot, and the gravestones stood like silent sentinels, their edges softened with white. Villagers passed by now and then, nodding hurriedly, their eyes still restless with the unease of recent talk. As she paused to straighten a wreath toppled by the wind, her gaze wandered toward the narrow lane that led to Mr. Grant's residence. The snow there told its own quiet tale. Clear, firm footprints, heavy, deliberate, led directly up to the solicitor's gate. That much was expected. After all, he had returned home the previous night. But what caught Miss Marple's keen eye were the marks leading away. A second set of prints, smaller, lighter, ran from the gate back toward the village. They were hurried, irregular, and here and there one could see where the edge of a branch or broom had been dragged clumsily, as though in an effort to obscure them. The attempt was plain, yet imperfect. Miss Marple bent slightly, her gloved hand resting upon her stick, and studied the faint pattern. "Ah," she murmured softly, as if to herself, "people do so often forget that snow records truth more faithfully than memory." Straightening, she continued her walk, appearing as nothing more than a gentle old lady admiring the winter day. Yet her mind was already at work, filing away the image of those prints. Someone had been at Mr. Grant's house after his departure from the feast, and someone had wished very much not to be seen. Chapter 3. The Arrest of a Maid. By the following day, the restless murmur of suspicion had found its first victim. Clara, the Hargreaves' maid, a timid girl of barely 20, was seen weeping in the yard as neighbors passed. It did not take long for whispers to harden into accusation. Someone recalled vividly, as villagers so often do, that Clara had once worked for Mr. Grant, and, more importantly, that she had been dismissed. Dismissals in Marleycombe never went unremarked. At the post office, Mrs. Penfold reminded anyone within earshot of the quarrel she had overheard, Grant's sharp voice scolding, Clara's muffled sobs. At the grocer's, Mr. Trask repeated with relish how Grant had accused her of carelessness. In the tea-room, the tale grew darker. Clara had slammed a door, refused an order, threatened to show him one day. Each retelling embroidered the fabric, until motives seemed woven beyond doubt. Clara herself denied it with trembling earnestness. "I never did nothing, Miss Marple, I swear it," she sobbed, twisting her apron in her hands. "He said I dropped the silver tray, but I never did. He wanted me gone, that's all. But I wouldn't hurt him, I wouldn't hurt nobody." Her tear-stained face, pale with fright, told its own story. But villagers, uneasy with mysteries, sought comfort in certainty. And Clara, poor and friendless, was easy to point at. Miss Marple, watching quietly from her corner seat, thought how very human it was to build a case out of fragments of memory and gossip. Yet tears, in her experience, were seldom faked so convincingly. And Clara's terror seemed not the guilt of one caught out, but the despair of one trapped in a snare not of her own making. The arrival of Inspector Cray from the market town was greeted with a mixture of relief and apprehension. A tall man with bristling mustaches and a habit of puffing out his chest as though to fill every room he entered, he wasted no time in establishing authority. At the rectory, before a gathering of anxious villagers, he cleared his throat with theatrical weight and announced that the matter was, in his words, practically settled. His gaze swept over the crowd and came to rest on poor Clara, pale and trembling by the hearth. With the flourish of a man accustomed to being agreed with, he declared her guilty. Dismissed in disgrace from Grant's household, harboring resentment, placed in the very kitchen where the pudding was prepared, it is as plain as day. A bone slipped in as a grotesque joke, a revenge trick to embarrass the gentleman and the village alike. Motive means opportunity. There you have it. A murmur ran through the hall. Some nodded quickly, eager for the dreadful affair to be concluded. Others shifted uncomfortably, casting furtive glances at Clara's tearful face. Yet none spoke against the inspector, for his uniform carried the weight of certainty they craved. Clara protested weakly, her voice breaking, "I never, sir, I never touched it." But her words were brushed aside with a brusque wave of the inspector's hand. Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the back, folded her hands in her lap. Her eyes rested not on Clara but on the inspector himself. Confidence was a useful tool, she reflected, but it often blinded men to the subtler threads of truth. And in her long acquaintance with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that what appeared as plain as day was often only the surface of night. When Inspector Cray had finished his declaration, a hush lingered in the room, broken only by Clara's muffled sobs. Most present were relieved enough to let the matter rest there. Yet Miss Marple, with her shawl drawn neatly about her shoulders, cleared her throat ever so gently. The sound was soft, but in the silence it carried. "I wonder," she said, in her mild, reflective tone, "if we are not perhaps mistaken in attributing such an act to Clara." All eyes turned to her, some curious, others impatient. The inspector's mustache bristled with irritation. Miss Marple's gaze rested kindly upon the trembling maid. "She seems to me far too frightened a creature to commit a deed intended to shock an entire village. It requires a certain imagination, does it not, to think of concealing such a dreadful object in a pudding? And imagination, I fancy, is not Clara's strong suit." A ripple passed through the listeners. Some frowned, others shifted uneasily. The inspector gave a short, dismissive laugh. "My dear madam, criminals are often fools. A clumsy prank, nothing more." Miss Marple only smiled, the faintest curve of her lips. "I would not call it clumsy," she murmured. "On the contrary, it was rather deliberate. And when things are deliberate, one must look not to the simplest answer, but to the truest." Her words settled quietly, like snow upon eaves, unnoticed by many but remembered by those with ears to hear. Miss Marple had planted her doubt, and in time doubt would grow. Chapter 4. The Solicitor's Secrets. The locked study of Mr. Percival Grant was finally opened under Inspector Cray's supervision, though the man made much of jangling keys and giving orders to constables. The villagers, huddled in the hall outside, waited with bated breath. When at last the heavy oak door creaked open, the room revealed itself in sober shadows, shelves of neat law books, a desk polished to a dull gleam, and drawers closed with unnerving precision. It was in the top drawer that a discovery came to light. A ledger, bound in cracked leather, lay tucked beneath neat stacks of correspondence. At first glance, it seemed unremarkable, a solicitor's record of accounts. But as Inspector Cray flipped through the pages, his voice grew sharp with surprise. Names. Dozens of them, each belonging to someone in Marleycombe. Against each name, figures were carefully inked: pounds, shillings, pence. Some were modest sums, others startlingly large. Margins carried cryptic notations: "Due soon," "Remind," "Private." The whispers began before the inspector had even shut the book. Debts, loans, or something darker, blackmail, perhaps. Mrs. Penfold clutched her scarf and muttered that she'd always suspected Grant of knowing too much about people. At the back, the butcher exchanged a guilty glance with the vicar, though neither spoke. The ledger was passed round like a holy relic, each villager pale as they wondered if their own secrets lay within its pages. Miss Marple, seated in a straight-backed chair, watched the ripples of alarm with thoughtful eyes. To her, the sums were not merely numbers. They were motives, tidily inked, quietly damning, and dangerous enough to unravel the peace of Marleycombe altogether. The afternoon brought with it a heavy fog, curling along Marleycombe's lanes like smoke from some unseen fire. At the rectory parlour, where tea had been laid but barely touched, Mrs. Linton sat hunched upon the edge of her chair. Her gloved hands twisted together as though they sought to wring courage from one another. "I cannot keep it any longer," she whispered, her eyes darting to the closed door. "It will out, and perhaps it is better so." Miss Marple inclined her head gently, while Inspector Cray leaned forward, eager for sensation. The widow's pale lips trembled. "Mr. Grant, he knew too much about Henry's estate. My husband was never good with papers, you see. When he died, there were irregularities. Debts Henry had concealed from me. I begged Mr. Grant for leniency, but instead, her voice broke. Instead, he pressed me. He said unless I did as he required, my reputation and what little security I had would be lost." Gasps fluttered around the room like startled birds. Mrs. Linton closed her eyes, steadying herself. "He forced me to sell a parcel of land, cheaply, far too cheaply. He profited, I know he did. And he threatened, always threatened. I thought I was alone in it, but now I see. I was not." Her confession left the room in silence, save for the clock's solemn tick. Inspector Cray puffed out his chest, declaring it a matter of interest, certainly. But Miss Marple's gaze rested upon the trembling widow with quiet sympathy, for she knew such confessions were seldom given lightly, and never without deeper shadows lurking just behind. That evening, as a smaller gathering convened in the vicar's sitting-room, the conversation circled once more to the grisly centerpiece of the affair, the Christmas pudding. A pot of tea steamed on the hearth, though few seemed inclined to drink. The villagers spoke in halting phrases, as though the very memory of the dish set their throats dry. Inspector Cray dismissed it briskly. A childish prank, no more. An attempt to shock. Our Clara is quite capable of such spite. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting resting idle in her lap, lifted her head. "Forgive me, Inspector," she said gently, "but pranks, even cruel ones, rarely choose so deliberate a token." The room quieted. Her voice was soft, yet it carried with unmistakable clarity. "A bone, and not merely any bone, but one small enough to be hidden in a slice, one certain to be noticed. Consider that, if you please. A coin in pudding is good fortune, a thimble ill luck, a ring a promise of marriage. Symbols, each of them. And what, then, might a bone signify?" The vicar, paling, murmured, "Burial." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed. To place it there is to speak without words. Something is hidden, something buried. It is not a prank. It is a message." A ripple of unease travelled the circle. Mrs. Hargreaves clutched her shawl tighter, as though the chill had deepened. Inspector Cray harumphed, but offered no retort. In the hush that followed, Miss Marple returned her eyes to her knitting. Her needles moved once more, steady and unhurried, though her thoughts ran swifter than any hand could stitch. For she felt sure the pudding had been chosen not for jest, but for its symbolism. Someone in Marleycombe had spoken, boldly, grimly, through its sugared crust. Chapter 5. A Second Shock. It was the village boys who found him. They had gone to the copse beyond Marleycombe to gather kindling, their laughter carrying thin and sharp over the frozen fields. But laughter turned to shrieks, and shrieks brought the men from the smithy running. There, among the frost-bitten bracken, lay Mr. Percival Grant. His body was stiff with the bitter cold, his overcoat stiffened by ice where dew had settled overnight. The snow about him was disturbed, muddied with prints and broken twigs, as though there had been a struggle. A thin trickle of blood, now darkened, marked his temple. Inspector Cray arrived in grand haste, his boots crunching upon the icy ground. He declared bluntly that Mr. Grant had met his end by a blow to the head, murder, beyond question. The word seemed to linger in the air, dreadful and undeniable. Villagers clustered at the edge of the wood, their breath rising like smoke. Murmurs swelled, of debts unpaid, threats made, enemies earned. The pudding, so recently dismissed as prank or omen, now stood as something else entirely, the herald of a crime. Miss Marple, standing a little apart with her walking stick steady in hand, bent her head over the scene. Her gaze took in the bruising, the scattered twigs, the curious absence of footprints leading directly away. The snow told stories, if one only cared to listen. She murmured, almost to herself, the pudding was no warning of what might be, but of what already had been. The words, quiet as they were, reached those nearest her, and they shivered not from the cold alone. For now, Marleycombe knew, the shadow over Christmas was murder, and it had struck from within their very midst. The following morning, in the sombre hush of the rectory study, the Reverend Pembroke laid out a bundle of papers recovered from Mr. Grant's coat. They were sodden at the edges, stiffened by frost, yet one sheet stood out, a letter, half-written, its ink blotted by haste and weather alike. The vicar's voice quavered slightly as he read aloud. "My patience is at its end. You promised me fairness, and yet I see only deceit. If you think you may cheat me, you are gravely mistaken. I shall expose you, and the whole of Marleycombe shall know the truth of your treachery." There the writing stopped, the pen stroke trailing into a broken smear, as though snatched away mid-word. The paper bore no name, no addressee, no signature. Only anger, unfinished, suspended like a voice cut off in a storm. The villagers crowded close, whispering fiercely among themselves. Who was this unnamed betrayer? The baker? The landlord? The widow already burdened with her confession? Each felt the sting of suspicion, for each knew their own conscience was not spotless. Inspector Cray puffed and declared the letter further proof of Clara's mischief, no doubt, but the words rang hollow. For the letter's tone was not one of a servant, but of a man locked in battle with equals, or rivals. Miss Marple, who had listened without interruption, regarded the broken smear of ink. "Strange," she murmured, "how words may betray what men will not speak aloud. Yet it is not the anger that interests me, but the silence where it ends." That evening, Marleycombe lay hushed beneath its quilt of snow. Windows glowed faintly along the lane, yet within her own cottage Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting basket untouched at her side. Instead, she gazed into the coals, letting their slow shift of embers guide her thoughts. Mr. Grant, she reflected, had not been a man beloved. He had pried, pressed, and profited from the troubles of others. To some he was a solicitor, to others a tormentor with a ledger as sharp as any blade. And such men do not leave this world unmourned. They leave behind, rather, a tangle of resentment and secrets. She recalled, with the clarity of a mind trained to pattern, a case many years ago in a northern village. There, too, a man had known too much, had held others in fear of exposure. He had been silenced swiftly, but not before leaving some sign of what he had uncovered. The village had whispered for decades afterward, though none dared speak it plainly. "History," Miss Marple murmured to the fire, "has a habit of repeating itself. Not in the particulars, but in the nature of people. Fear of ruin, fear of shame, it drives hands to desperate measures." Her blue eyes narrowed slightly. Grant had left not only enemies but evidence, a ledger, a letter, and the strange, terrible symbol of the bone in the pudding. Each was a fragment of a larger truth. And though others sought quick answers, Miss Marple knew better. Murder was seldom simple. It grew from human weakness, festering long before the final blow was struck. With that thought, she reached for her knitting at last, her needles clicking softly, as if keeping time with the dark currents of the village's secrets. Chapter 6. The Web Tightens. The rectory drawing-room was warm with lamplight and the fragrance of mulled wine, though outside the snow lay deep and still. At Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, several villagers had gathered for tea, Mrs. Hargreaves with her ever-trembling hands, the vicar seated stiffly beside her, Mrs. Linton pale and withdrawn, and even the butcher, red-cheeked and blustering. Inspector Cray had been persuaded to join, though he looked faintly put out at the prospect of parlour chatter. Miss Marple presided with her usual mild courtesy, pouring tea and pressing seed cake upon her guests. Her talk meandered, or seemed to, old recipes for Christmas puddings, the peculiarities of family wills, the tradition of hiding trinkets in festive dishes. She spoke of past years when coins or charms had brought either delight or disappointment. The guests answered with nervous laughter or hasty comments, yet Miss Marple's eyes noted more than her ears received. Mrs. Linton started visibly at the mention of wills. The butcher coughed too quickly when debts were alluded to. Mrs. Hargreaves nearly dropped her teacup when bones were mentioned, while Inspector Cray grew impatient with what he termed kitchen nonsense. Yet beneath the surface of trivialities, the atmosphere thickened. Each guest, Miss Marple observed, betrayed themselves not with words, but with a sudden glance, the silence that followed too long, the blush that rose unbidden. By the time the clock chimed 5, the gathering had seemed to most no more than a harmless tea. But Miss Marple, in her quiet seat by the hearth, had gleaned much. Threads were beginning to show in the tapestry of lies, and she was already tugging at the one she believed might unravel the rest. It was during the same gathering, over the second pot of tea, that Miss Marple turned the conversation, ever so lightly, toward family visits at Christmastide. She remarked how journeys in the snow could be troublesome, and how one always hoped to arrive safely at a sister's hearth before the carols ended. Mrs. Hargreaves, who had been stirring her cup with unnecessary vigor, looked up too quickly. "Why, yes, of course. I was with my sister on Christmas Eve," she said, her voice just a touch too bright. "She will tell you so herself." The room grew still in the way parlors do when a ripple of doubt is felt but not voiced. It was then that Miss Marple, with her usual air of innocent inquiry, turned toward Mrs. Hargreaves's sister, quiet Mrs. Elkins, seated modestly at the far end. Mrs. Elkins flushed. Well, dear," she began hesitantly, "I fear you mistake the hour. You did not arrive until the following morning. Quite early, it is true, but morning none the less. Why, I recall because the milkman was just at his round." A silence, sharp and sudden, fell upon the room. Mrs. Hargreaves's spoon clattered against the saucer. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and pressed her lips together in a thin line. Inspector Cray pounced, triumphant. "There you are! A false alibi! Proof, if proof were needed, that Mrs. Hargreaves has deceived us all." The others murmured uneasily, eyes narrowing toward the woman who had baked the fatal pudding. Miss Marple, however, only folded her hands upon her lap, her expression unreadable. She had noted the falsehood, certainly, but she also knew that lies were not always the same as guilt. Some lies hid shame, others fear, and a few concealed truths far darker than either. 2 days after the dreadful discovery, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Mrs. Elkins, her manner all gentleness and tact. "You know, my dear," she said with a mild smile, "tradition is often the best cure for unease. A village Christmas cannot properly conclude without a pudding. Perhaps, if another were prepared, it might restore a little comfort to Marleycombe." Word spread quickly that a second pudding would be made, this time in the rectory kitchen under many watchful eyes. Mrs. Elkins, who possessed a steadier hand than her sister, took up the task, while the vicar's wife bustled to ensure each ingredient was measured and accounted for. Even Inspector Cray stationed a constable at the door, though he made much of the trouble it caused. Miss Marple alone seemed calm, knitting in the corner, her eyes occasionally straying toward the mixing bowl. She had remarked, in her soft way, that symbols often betray their authors. A hand that once chose to speak through pudding, she mused, may not resist the chance to speak again. The kitchen buzzed with nervous chatter as raisins were stirred, suet folded, brandy poured. Nothing untoward occurred, yet the very expectation hung thick in the air. When at last the pudding was tied, steamed, and set aside, Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest nod. A trap had been laid, not with rope or snare, but with custard and spice, with the irresistible lure of a criminal's compulsion. Somewhere in Marleycombe, she felt sure, a murderer's hand itched to repeat its message. And when it did, she would be waiting. Chapter 7. Miss Marple's Revelation. Christmas night returned to the rectory, and with it, a gathering both smaller and more tense than the one before. Candles burned low, shadows dancing along the walls, while the second pudding was carried in amidst a silence so complete that even the crackle of the fire sounded loud. The brandy was lit, the blue flames flickering briefly, and slices were carefully cut under the watch of every villager present. Forks hovered, breaths held. Piece after piece revealed nothing but dark fruit and rich sponge. No bone, no ghastly symbol, only pudding. A collective sigh rose, part relief, part disappointment. Inspector Cray puffed himself up, declaring the whole business of bones in puddings at an end. Yet Miss Marple, seated a little apart, only smiled gently into her plate. For she knew the true pudding had been served long before, when whispers had tangled and alibis had cracked. This second dish was not bait for bones, it was bait for nerves. And in that quiet room, she had watched keenly the faces of her neighbors as each slice passed. Who leaned forward with too much eagerness? Who turned pale when nothing appeared? Who sighed as if cheated of some dreadful triumph? The answers lay not in the pudding, but in the people. Miss Marple set down her fork, folded her hands, and let her smile rest faintly upon her lips. The trap had been sprung. not by what lay hidden in suet and raisins, but by what could no longer be hidden in the guilty heart. When the last of the plates had been cleared, Miss Marple rose from her chair with a softness that belied the weight of her words. The villagers stilled, sensing something momentous. Even Inspector Cray, though bristling, folded his arms and listened. "My dear friends," she began gently, "this matter has troubled us all, but the truth, though unpleasant, has been before us from the very beginning. Mr. Grant was a man who lived by secrets. He kept them tidily written, as in his ledger, and used them to pressure those too ashamed to speak out. Such habits earn enemies, and one of those enemies sat among us still." All eyes turned to Mrs. Hargreaves. She stiffened, color draining from her cheeks. Miss Marple continued, calm but steady. "Mr. Grant threatened to expose debts your household could not meet. You feared ruin. And so, on Christmas Eve, you went to him, not to plead, but to silence. The blow was struck in the copse. Yet a secret so large cannot remain buried. Thus, the bone in the pudding, a warning, a little display meant to frighten others away from seeking what was hidden." A murmur rippled through the room. Mrs. Hargreaves trembled. "That is absurd. A dreadful story." "Not so dreadful as your false alibi," Miss Marple said, her blue eyes unwavering. "Your sister, in her innocence, corrected you. You were not with her Christmas Eve. You were elsewhere, with Mr. Grant. And when you returned, you baked the pudding, weaving into it your silent, ghastly signal. Silence fell, heavy as snow. Then, at last, Mrs. Hargreaves's hands dropped to her lap. She did not confess, but her face, drawn, defeated, spoke more clearly than words. The room knew. Miss Marple had unveiled the truth. For a long moment after Miss Marple spoke, silence held the room as tightly as frost grips the hedgerows. Mrs. Hargreaves sat rigid, her hands clutching at the fabric of her skirt, her breath shallow and uneven. Then, as though some inner dam had given way, she began to weep, first in small, broken sobs, then in floods of wretched sound that seemed to hollow the room of all warmth. "Yes," she cried, "I struck him. He would have ruined us, destroyed all we had. He threatened to tell the whole village of our debts, to take the house, the shop, everything. I could not bear it. I only wished to frighten the others with the pudding, to make them fear to pry. I never meant. Oh, God forgive me!" The villagers, shocked into stillness, exchanged uneasy glances. Some muttered prayers, others covered their mouths as though against blasphemy. Mrs. Linton, pale but resolute, reached for Clara's hand, whispering that the poor girl's name would be cleared. Clara herself, though shaken, lifted her tear-stained face with a flicker of hope. Inspector Cray straightened, his voice officious but unsteady. "The law will take its course. Mrs. Hargreaves, you must come with me." Yet even he seemed chastened, his pomp deflated by the raw truth laid bare. Miss Marple did not gloat nor scold. She merely folded her hands, her expression one of gentle sorrow. For she knew that justice, in villages such as these, was never merely the province of the courts. It was lived in whispers, in judgments, in scars carried quietly. And as Mrs. Hargreaves was led away, Marleycombe exhaled at last, grief-stricken, chastened, yet faintly relieved that the shadow over Christmas had been named. Chapter 8. Snowfall over Marleycombe. The days that followed were softened by snow, as though nature herself had laid a fresh quilt over Marleycombe to hush its troubles. It was not the wild, blustering snow that whipped across fields and made travelers curse their luck, but a gentle, unhurried drifting, flakes that seemed to pause in the air, settle on a bonnet brim, and melt without fuss. White drifts lined the sloping roofs of cottages, smoothing away their uneven tiles. Garden gates wore frosted crowns, and the hedgerows bowed beneath soft mounds, as though weighed down by sleep. Smoke rose in calm spirals from chimneys, carrying with it the smell of peat and pine. One could almost believe the village had exhaled, weary from its brush with darkness, and now rested under a blanket of peace. At the market square, life slowly resumed its familiar bustle. The greengrocer polished apples until they gleamed like rubies. Bolts of bright wool and sturdy cloth were unfurled across a stall, promising new skirts and Sunday coats for the new year. The fishmonger, red-cheeked and hearty, bellowed cheerfully about the freshness of his catch, as if the grim events of Christmas Eve had never touched Marleycombe shores. Villagers moved through the square with renewed purpose. After days of whispering suspicion and uneasy glances, they welcomed ordinary errands with gratitude. There was comfort in choosing a joint of meat, or haggling over the price of turnips, or simply greeting a neighbor with talk of the weather. It was as though each small exchange stitched back together the fabric of village life. The church bells, too, seemed to join in the restoration. They had tolled solemnly when Mr. Grant's body was discovered, their weighty notes rolling across fields like a warning. Now they rang brighter peals, announcing services, christenings, and the promise of weddings to come once spring returned. Their sound carried hope, rising above the rooftops, mingling with the caws of rooks and the scrape of shovels clearing paths. Children, muffled in scarves and mittens, skated across the frozen pond at the meadow's edge. Their shrieks of laughter echoed like bells themselves as blades carved silver arcs upon the ice. Mothers called half-hearted warnings from the bank, stamping their boots to keep warm, while fathers kept a cautious eye yet allowed the little ones their freedom. It was a scene of ordinary joy, the sort that villages treasure all the more keenly after shadows have passed too close. Clara, the Hargreaves' maid, returned quietly to her duties. She moved about the shop with lowered eyes at first, embarrassed by the gossip that had once condemned her. Yet neighbors greeted her kindly now, as though eager to wipe away their own haste to judge. A few contrite souls left small offerings at her door, an iced cake wrapped in muslin, a length of ribbon, even a hand-knit shawl. Such gestures, though modest, spoke volumes in a place where reputation could be broken with a single whisper. Clara bore it all with humility, her cheeks flushed with both gratitude and relief. Still, beneath the cheer, there lingered a gentleness that came only after reflection. Marleycombe had peered into darkness, and found it disturbingly close to home. Now, in reprieve, it clung all the more fiercely to ordinary comforts. Gossip over steaming cups of tea, the hum of hymn practice drifting from the vestry, the smell of bread cooling on window-sills. Every small thing felt cherished, as though the villagers feared it might slip away if not carefully tended. Life, in its English way, had returned to rhythm. But like footprints beneath a fresh fall of snow, the memory of what had passed would not so easily vanish. At her cottage on the edge of the village, Miss Marple sat before the fire. Her teapot warmed on the hob, and a plate of currant scones rested within reach. Outside, snow drifted steadily down, quieting the lane until the whole world seemed hushed in reverence. She poured herself a cup, added a spoon of sugar, and let her thoughts roam, as they always did when one mystery closed and another waited somewhere unseen. It struck her, as it had many times before, that evil seldom announced itself with grand fanfare. It came dressed in the ordinary, the respectable. A shopkeeper who minded his accounts too closely. A widow who wore her grief with too much pride. A maid with secrets best left unspoken. Or, in this case, Mrs. Hargreaves, apron tied neatly, recipes handed down faithfully, a woman who embodied domestic order. And yet beneath her tidy exterior had lived fear, debt, and desperation strong enough to drive her to murder. Miss Marple lifted her cup and gazed into the rising steam. "It is at Christmas, perhaps," she murmured to the quiet room, "when the burden of appearances weighs heaviest. A time when all must be merry, when debts, griefs, and hidden shames are pressed beneath holly and pudding. And yet—" she sipped her tea, pausing as if to let the thought unfurl. "And yet people are people. Desperate acts are not banished by carols." The fire cracked, scattering sparks. She gave a small nod, recalling truths she had long observed, that the extraordinary often wore the plainest of coats. "Evil," she continued softly, "is so very ordinary. It bakes bread, it ties packages, it lights the pudding with brandy flames. And when pressed, it may turn cruel, dressing its crime in the garments of tradition itself." Setting down her cup, Miss Marple reached for her knitting. Her needles clicked, steady and deliberate, as though she bound the world together stitch by stitch. Yet she knew, as she always did, that loose threads would appear anew. It was not despairing knowledge, but rather a readiness. Life, like her wool, unravelled and was mended again and again. The last embers in the grate glowed warmly, casting long shadows across her small sitting-room. She sat in her armchair, the steady rhythm of knitting underscoring the faint carols drifting in from the square. The voices rose and fell in merry harmony. "God rest ye merry, gentlemen," light-hearted, untroubled, as if Marleycombe had never been touched by whispers of murder. Miss Marple paused to listen, her eyes reflecting the flicker of firelight. Outside, snow continued its silent descent, cloaking hedgerows and rooftops alike in a softened veil. Children's laughter still carried faintly from the pond, where lanterns cast a gentle glow upon the ice. Families lingered together, clutching hot mugs, treasuring the warmth of companionship more dearly now. The village, she thought, was at peace again, for now. Shadows had crept close, yes, but they had been banished, at least for a season. Such was the nature of life. Darkness stirred, was revealed, and receded. And afterward, people returned to their daily tasks, the humdrum rhythm that gave existence both its charm and its cover. Miss Marple gave a small, satisfied nod and resumed her knitting. The wool grew row by row beneath her hands, a small order imposed upon chaos. "Well," she murmured, "Christmas is saved after all." The mantel clock ticked its patient beat. The carolers' voices faded into the night, leaving only the hush of falling snow. In her snug cottage, Miss Marple worked her needles with calm precision, a solitary figure keeping gentle watch over Marleycombe's fragile peace. For though the village slumbered content, she knew, as she always had, that somewhere, some day, another mystery would stir. But tonight, at least, the fire was warm, the snow was kind, and all was well. And so, dear friends, our tale of the corpse in the Christmas pudding draws to its close. We have walked together through snowy lanes and candlelit suppers, listened to the whispers of gossip in Marleycombe, and stood by as Miss Marple, quiet, observant, and ever so wise, unravelled a web of secrets knotted beneath the holly and ivy. Life in a village, as you have now seen, is never quite as simple as it seems. Behind every frosted window lies a story, sometimes sweet as plum cake, sometimes dark as midnight. The joy of Christmas, with its carols and puddings and laughter, can sit side by side with fear, suspicion, and desperate acts. And perhaps that is what makes such mysteries so compelling, the contrast between the warmth of the hearth and the chill of human motives. Tonight, Marleycombe rests in peace again. The market square bustles, the church bells chime, and children skate without care across the frozen pond. Yet the memory of what lay hidden in that pudding will linger, a reminder that even in the coziest of corners, secrets may stir. Before we part, I leave you with a thought. What would you have done had you been seated at that Christmas feast? Would you have laughed at the shock, dismissed it as a prank, or, like Miss Marple, noticed the danger wrapped in sugared raisins and brandy flame? I would love to hear your theories, your reflections, your sharp-eyed observations. Do share them in the comments below. For now, the fire burns low, the snow drifts quietly against the panes, and our mystery comes to rest. Until next time, when another tale beckons us to tea and deduction, I thank you warmly for listening, and wish you the safest and coziest of nights.